Projections, especially when it comes to fantasy football, are often a hot button topic. Here to pull the veil down from them, make it maybe a little less scary, is going to be RotoWire data scientist Paul Mammino here on the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. I am Jeff Erickson here with RotoWire data scientist Paul Mammino. We are sponsored by Circa and by Fantrax. Thank you again, guys, for your sponsorship there. Means a lot to us, helps us keep this podcast going. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Projections, not always everybody's favorite topic when we talk about fantasy football or fantasy sports in general, but they're vital. They help us get a window into what we're looking at with the players. You know, they can be used properly. They can be abused. They can be done improperly. A lot of things that can happen with them. We're going to try to make them a little less scary today. Paul Mammino is our RotoWire data scientist. Paul, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining the company.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to talk projections and talk with you about this stuff. So
let's talk about your background and how you got into this in the first place, because I always like people to get to know who we're talking with a little bit. And, this can be scary stuff, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. My background and my main focus has always been baseball. I was a baseball player in college, so I had a lot of interest in that. But I also was interested in math, which, not everybody actually likes math as much as I do. So when I kind of love sports and I love fantasy sports, I've played since I was a kid. Math and computer science and statistics, that was all real crossover for the data science side of things, and that was also kind of for the fantasy sports side of things. So I've kind of done some other work outside of the industry, done a lot of stuff on my own, built my own projections for fantasy baseball, fantasy football, for DFS and other things like that, and just kind of have slowly been around writing, podcasting, doing different things. And then there was a job posting here, so I was able to join on and hopefully help improve the projections, and as you said, make them a little less scary and a little something that people can trust a little more.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about their application to fantasy football and fantasy football drafting, because, there will be people that will just go with a straight list. They won't use projections at all. How do you use projections? Do you use them more for season long? Obviously for DFS, I feel like there's a more applicable model, but for redraft, for season long leagues, how do you use your projections?
I think kind of as you said, you need to turn those projections into rankings. That's one of the other things that I'm kind of trying to work on here, is like figuring out how to set proper for each league, like a proper replacement level, right? If you only start one quarterback, it doesn't really matter that they're going to be the highest projected players. If you're in a super flex or something like that, you need to adjust for those. But I think one of the other things that's really important when it comes to projections is understanding like the different pockets of the draft. Like if I hit a pocket where running backs are projected higher than wide receivers, but I also know 3 rounds later that's going to flip, and it's going to flip in such a way that makes the 2v2 essentially of taking a receiver first or running back first versus the vice versa, I can actually understand what those different projections are going to do for my team, right? If I end up taking the higher projected running back now and then I need to take a receiver later, what is that going to actually do to the total points that my team scores? Because it doesn't really matter how you score points. All that matters in season long is really just how you end up at, versus your opponent or versus the rest of your league, however your scoring works. Right. So that's kind of the main thing that I would try to do. One of the other things that I'll tend to look at when it comes to projections, or that I think is really important for people to understand when it comes to projections, is like, why do they end up wrong, right? As you kind of alluded to, they end up wrong a lot. And I think this was like an old school running back dead zone like topic, right? Where you've got that running back that doesn't really project well in terms of their actual skill set. They're just going to get 80% of the carries. So when you look at a season-long projection, that guy, you have to give him 80% of the carries, but he might have a really low chance of actually keeping that, or he's a much higher chance of losing that job, right? So I think it's understanding like what is going into the individual projections. Is it like a high playing time, or is it something that we're actually projecting this player to either take a step forward or just really keep up elite efficiency? So I think that's like one of the most important topics when it comes to projections.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the running back dead zone players and the projections, because I do think this is an area where we go really wrong. We actually talked about this, Nick Whalen and I did, on the RotoWire Sirius XM show today, and talking about like, going back and looking at certain players, certain running backs, like, oh, there's nobody else there. He's got to get the carries. Right. And this is with Joe Bartle on the show with us. And there's always somebody, first of all, even though we may not identify that alternative, there's always somebody, especially at running back where it's a position of opportunity. But two, it's just, you have to look at the quality of the player. You have to look at it there. And I'm trying to remember the example of the player. I was on the Falcons in 2021. Just the name is
God.
Bear with me. I'll pull it up in a second, but it was really bugging me because, it's like, it's so true. Like there's no, there really isn't a situation there where that happens that it happens to be the case. And I've got the article up in front of me now, so we'll get to that here. But it was Mike Davis and it was the canonical, like, he's going to get such a target carry share, or maybe he won't be that good and he won't.
Right. And I think one of the other really important things is we also, especially with football, I know you do some of the baseball projections in the past, but like football more so than anything else is the coaches have such a huge impact on it, especially at the running back position, right? Like we might look at it, and I think Kyron is the guy that everybody consistently uses, like, because he's not really that efficient. But Sean McVay absolutely loves him and hands him the ball every single time and gives him all the running back opportunities, right?
Right.
So it doesn't matter what we think of him as a talent base, it's what the coaching staff thinks of him, right? And that happens the other way. We see all these players that we think they're these hyper efficient running backs, these hyper efficient receivers that should get way more targets, and they don't. So that's what makes football projections really hard, because we're trying to also guess how the coaches are going to interact, how the routes are going to actually work, like how they're going to scheme touches to different guys. It makes football projections tougher than I think most other sports. Like baseball, for the most part, if you hit, you're going to play. They're going to find a place to put you in the lineup for the most part, right? There's going to be some examples that are exceptions, but football, more so than anything else, it's really trying to predict how these coaches are going to work, as opposed to purely the skill of the player.
Yep. The role of stats in baseball and basketball and football and how they've advanced over the years has changed. Football has more advanced metrics than they've had in the past. Do you have a favorite leading indicator? And obviously it's per position. Let's talk running backs. We've been using that as our focus right now. Do you have a favorite leading indicator? Is a favorite advanced stat, or is it maybe just a basic stat that you like to do? It's a good predictor of the future.
I think for running backs, a big thing is like broken tackles or yards after contact or things like that, right? Because there's two things. A lot of what they're going to get before contact is going to be how well their line actually blocks for them. If the hole is open, and then it's more what can they do once they get into space, and that's more the broken tackles, yards after contact type stuff for running backs.
Very good. So who stands out to you as some players this year that might be better than people expect, or are just really good, other than the obvious, like big name running backs?
Well, I mean, I think, and if you look at the RotoWire projections, one of the names that might really stand out as high that might not necessarily be someone like Bucky Irving. Bucky was like really, really good at that last year. That was one of the things that he kind of excelled at, was breaking a ton of tackles. Once he gets into space, he's actually really good. He's obviously still going pretty high in most drafts, but like, I think he's one of those guys that if you look at a projection set and you kind of view it, he might be a sticker shock for a lot of people who are just kind of getting back into football, not quite realizing that how good he really was, and that he is kind of closer to those elites than I think maybe he might get credit for.
Yeah. Bucky Irving is a perfect example of why you draft early. Before the consensus kind of congeals around the fact that, hey, he is really awesome and he deserves that second round price tag. There were early drafts where you got him in the third round, fourth round, maybe not fourth round. Maybe I'm overstating the case, but that price is set now. And Tristan Wirfs is probably going to be out to start the season. You lose your top tackle. That could be a problem. But then again, you're talking about after contact is one of the things he's so good at, that kind of ameliorates some of the problem there.
Right. Exactly. And I think one of the other things that's really important to note is, like, I play a lot of best ball, so it's a little tougher for me with that, but like, even in season long, those weeks that Wirfs is probably going to miss, those are the least important weeks for your fantasy teams, right? So you really want Bucky to be kind of turning it on for the playoff stretch and things like that, in pretty much every league you would play in. So I don't think it's too much of a worry, even though that might be something that impacts him in the beginning. Yeah,
and it's not like he's going to be a zero there either. It's not like he's gone. It's unlike, say, Rashee Rice, who's going to be suspended for an indeterminate amount of period of time. You'll still be able to use Bucky Irving, even if the tackle situation isn't what we want it to be. So I think that's important too. One thing that football is better about with projecting than baseball is you mentioned it earlier. You don't care how the player gets there. It's just that he gets there. Yeah. Whereas in baseball and roto, we're trying to compete within categories in addition to overall production.
Yeah. And I think that's also something that's really important to know when you're looking at, when you're using projections to do your drafting, right? Like, how does this player get there? As you said, it's not as important in roto. It's really important for baseball. But like, if you have a running back, like James Cook was a good example from last year, who got all of his production pretty much from scoring touchdowns, right? So much of his fantasy point came from how many touchdowns he was scoring. Those players are going to be a little bit more fragile just because touchdowns can go in a lot of different directions. The team can score from further out. The offense could take a different approach around the goal line. They might, decide to throw instead of run or something along those lines. So I think if you have players who are like really heavily touchdown based, it's really important to know that in your projections, because that might be more fragile just because, if a guy goes from 10 touchdowns to 6, that's a lot of points that you're losing over the course of the season, even if everything else holds true.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. James Cook has a lot of different variables. The touchdown luck is one of them. The contract situation is another one of them there.
Yeah.
How are you handling? I know this is a little far afield for projections, but it still matters a little bit there. When a player is a holdout possibility, Terry McLaurin's a great example of that right now. How long along the path do you have to go before you change his projection?
Well, I think when it comes to for me, it's going to be probably, I would trust that unless he starts, unless it seems like he's going to actually miss a game, that I'm probably not going to change much of anything. For a player like McLaurin, because he's a little bit more of a veteran. Rookies, if they were to hold out, or rookies like Luther Burden's not really practicing right now, so I think that it's pretty reasonable, like, as we get closer and he's still not practicing, to either move his targets down, or maybe move some of the efficiency metrics down and kind of work with the projections that way, maybe make him a little bit less efficient, just because, as we kind of talked about, if you're a player like him missing time, you're not going to get the trust of your coaching staff. They're not going to put you out in as many routes. They're not going to let you, even if you're the most efficient receiver in the league, they're probably not going to let you play quite as much if you're missing time for something like that. Someone like Rice, I think, once we know what his missed time is, what the suspensions can actually be, and Addison as well, I'm not going to really change their metrics much, because like, they're not coming back from an injury. So I don't think there's going to be any adjustment to their efficiency or anything like that, or they're not really going to be on snap counts. They're probably going to be all systems go once they get out there. Maybe the Chiefs offense looks a little different and they start using Worthy more than they would have if both Rice and Worthy were healthy to start the season. But I think that's going to be kind of dependent on how Worthy's looking while Rice is out. So I think it's kind of a player by player, adjustment. And one of the things that we do really well is we've got a bunch of people who are really plugged into news and things like that. And I think that they are where it's going to be more of the adjustments and kind of understanding what they're hearing and what the coaches are saying, and kind of adjusting off that.
Right on. Totally. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Before we talk about projecting rookies generally, because I think they are their own special category, we got a quick note from our friends over at the NFFC. Over at Circa Million. Sorry, folks. Circa is Circa Million and the Circa Survivor. We love the Circa Casino and Sportsbook there. Fantastic place. They are back again with a massive $20 million in guaranteed prizes. Circa Million. It's pick 5 games against the spread each week. 18 weeks of action with 126 ways to win. $1 million for the winner and $6 million guaranteed. Circa Survivor. 1 pick a week. No point spread. Last the longest to win it all. At least $15 million guaranteed. Enter in Nevada. Play from anywhere. $21 million guaranteed. Visit circasports.com for details. Thanks to Circa. As always, we'll be out there. Nick Whalen and I will be for Radio Row in a couple of weeks to help promote those contests, do some shows from there. Very excited about that. I am talking with RotoWire data scientist Paul Mammino. He does a lot of work on our projections. Paul, trying to project rookies, how hard is that? What sort of special tasks or steps do you go through and doing when you go through the process of trying to do it, project what a rookie is going to do?
Yeah. So this was one of the first years where I had to really try to project rookies from a season-long standpoint. So it's kind of an interesting problem. Most of what I would do would be daily, so it was a little bit different. But rookies are really interesting because you're working with a bunch of different data. You're working with their college data. You're working with some combine data and determining if that stuff even matters and how successful they're going to be in a regular in the actual season. And you're also kind of worrying about what is the timelines that you're trying to project, right? A lot of people that are building rookie models, they're building stuff for dynasty leagues, right? They care how these guys are going to be 2-3 years down the road. What we were really looking at is how are these guys going to be in year one? And that was one of the more, difficult and more challenging problems, because with college data, you have really an incomplete amount of data, and you have a bunch of players playing against different competition. So you really have to take into account, like, who are they playing against? What are these numbers actually saying? Like Trey Harris plays in a really interesting Ole Miss offense, and like he ended up with some really ridiculous video game numbers where I think he had like a 5 yards per target or something just insane like that. So it's trying to understand how all of these pieces kind of come together. But I think one of the things that, like, after everything that I was doing to try to redo how we did rookie projections this offseason, the biggest thing that it came out is just like, when do they get drafted? Like, it's really just everything kind of funnels towards what is their draft capital, right? All the combine stuff, for the most part, what it does is it's mostly just leading towards where they get drafted, where they fall within a given draft, and where they fall within each other, right? Like Caleb Johnson was really successful in college, but he didn't run that fast, so he kind of fell relative to some of the other running backs that had similar production and things like that. And then Bashal Tutin, he shoots up because he ran really fast. So all of that kind of is just pushing towards understanding the efficiency and then where they actually got drafted. And like where they got drafted tells us a ton. Like one of the big ones that it kind of Matthew Golden was one of the most interesting ones for me that actually I was able to point out when I was going through it. All these guys that get drafted in that like 20 range over the last few years, even the ones that like busted, like Jalen Reagor, Kadarius Toney, a lot of those guys got pretty good target shares in year one, right? They were given opportunities in year one. Most of the time it's because the teams needed them. Most of the time it's because the offenses were, missing a number one receiver. And he kind of fits that, right? The Packers don't really have that number one receiver. You can think Jaden Reed is, but they don't really let him run as a one. He pretty much plays as a slot. So I think it kind of shows that like Golden should get a pretty good opportunity in year one. And then what happens from a dynasty standpoint is however he does in year one will kind of point it the rest of the way, right? Like Quentin Johnston's another one. Johnson got a decent target share, not as good as some of the other players. It was actually one of the worst, I think, in like the cohort for the last few years. But that was why he failed as much. But again, like Reagor, all these other guys, they actually got good target shares in year one. So it's kind of just really thinking that draft capital is really doing a lot of the work, and that's kind of the thing that you should really focus on when you're trying to project rookies.
Kind of an aside here, but I think it's kind of poetic that Johnston and Reagor are on the same team now this year and last year as well.
Right.
Kind of follow they can give each other pointers on how to be a bust, but even though I hate using the word bust, but you know what I'm saying. But how to deal with that. Yeah. Hey, let's stay with the Chargers though. Hampton. I think he was the cover art for this podcast here. There's been some hot takes, especially about him in the last day or two, moving up a tier. One of the things we do is upside down, upside and floor with projections a little bit there. He seems like a guy we could probably, adjust a little bit on the fly.
Yeah, I think he's someone that I think it's going to be really important over the next couple of weeks to figure out like what does Harris look like going into the start of the season, because if you were to look at like the upside projections that we've been working on, Hampton doesn't really come up that high. And I think a big part of that is because we're still projecting a large amount of the carries and things to go to Najee Harris. So if it looks like from, day one, Hampton's going to be getting 15 to 20 carries a week, and, he's going to be in that like elite usage, then I think you're going to see his like ceiling really shoot up. He's a guy who should adjust really quickly because I think that the skill set is what it is. He's a pretty good receiver. He should get a lot of touch. That offense should be very run heavy. They're probably going to run in the red zone. All of these things are really conducive to big running back seasons. But I think for him, it's just a matter of how much of a fly in the ointment is Najee Harris really going to be. And I think we'll get more clarity on that over the next couple of weeks because, as has been pointed out by a lot of different people, I think is Harris is kind of there to be the veteran presence in day one. And if he's not there day one, then it's kind of hard to take away Hampton's touches when Najee is healthy and ready to go if Hampton really looks as good as people think he can.
Indeed. And it's interesting because we have a lot of, veteran running back, rookie, highly drafted rookie running back combos where the rookie is getting drafted before the veteran. With the Chargers with Hampton and Harris. When you look at the Steelers with Caleb Johnson and Jalen Warren, you look at the Pats, Travion Henderson and Ramondre Stevenson. Those are three off the top of my head. Oh, Denver, RJ Harvey also in his situation there. Harvey's price has gone way down ever since they signed J.K. Dobbins. But it's interesting. In all four of those cases there, the rookie goes first, even though the projection may say otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that it kind of goes to the point that I was trying to make with Bucky, where really the things that we care about the most at the end of season, right? It's heightened in best ball, but it's definitely something that happens in season long as well. You care about how the end of the season is going to look. And a lot of times with these running back situations, it's a split between the veteran and the rookie early on. And then as the season goes on, the rookie starts to get more and more playing time, right? If we were looking at the end projection might not necessarily be showing the weekly ceiling that can actually occur. So I think that what we kind of would see over the course of a week, if you were to project out week by week, as the seasons went on, that rookie's projection would, start to reach the 12 plus point per game or something along those lines. And the veteran would start to kind of go to zero. So I think that's kind of why you see that phenomenon happen. But that's one thing that projections, or at least a full season long projection, really don't do a great job of highlighting, because both of those guys are going to look kind of similar, or the gap between them is going to look really small relative to the ADP gap. But I think it's just the understanding that we all have that, like, the end of the season is what matters. And we're kind of shooting for more of that upside at the end of year for them to get more carries and more touches.
And that's why this year in our projections, we're trying to incorporate a ceiling as well as a floor. And I'm using, for instance, our projections as our foundation for RotoWire's, the RotoWire tool, the draft assistant that we unveiled with it. It goes along with everything that we have in terms of RotoWire's draft kit. If you use our subscription, you can use that. I've been using the draft assistant a lot. I think it's really fun. But one of the things they do is it's not just suggested for you, best by position, likely gone, it includes the ADP, but also highest upside players. And that's something that, especially mid to late in the draft, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for that ceiling.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things, it was really cool working on that and trying to like piece that together. And really what a lot of that is it's improving or decreasing the efficiency of a player, right? Or like how many touchdowns per target or different touchdowns per target, touchdowns per rush, different things like that, moving those numbers. But also as those guys are more efficient, they're going to also get more touches and more carries and more things like that. So that was one of the big things. And I think the whole point was, as you're getting later in drafts, we kind of look at players and we say, I'm going to draft the more upside play or the safer play, depending on what you need. If you have a couple of rookie running backs, you probably want a more safer, more stable veteran late in your drafts, just for like the beginning of the season run and different things like that. But I think that one thing that's really important to understand when it comes to the ceiling and floor is that there's a couple different styles. There's like the players that have weekly ceiling and floor. So like a good example of that, I think, is like the Jameson Williams or some other like deep threat receiver type player. Their weekly ceiling and floor might be really big, but their actual full season might not necessarily be that high, right? Williams is probably never getting to 120 targets, 130 targets. What you're really seeing from his ceiling is just, is he turning more of those long catches into touchdowns? And is he actually completing on a few more? Are they actually completing a few more of those long touchdowns? Where like you have a player with a similar ceiling to him based on our projections is like a Lad McConkey, who's going to get more on actually getting a bunch more targets and getting a bunch more catches and things like that. So I think that's more of the full season ceiling, that type of a player, or something along those lines, where like a player like that who can actually take over more of a role, get more targets, get more touches and things like that. And then that's actually a different way of thinking about ceiling and floor. I think we kind of conflate the ceiling with the Williams types, but it's not necessarily, I think, the best way of thinking about ceiling.
Does it change your approach in best ball versus managed when looking for that type of player? Like, where would you rather have Williams, in a managed league, or would you rather have him in a best ball league? I imagine it's the latter, right?
Yeah, it's definitely the best ball, because like, it's the Williams is, you can go further down and go to like there's some like real deep threat types like a Dante Thornton, who's getting some hype around draft circles and things like that, at least on the best ball side. Those players who might get 4 targets in a game, but one of them might be a 60-yard touchdown, those guys are way better in a best ball format. You don't have to worry about trying to guess when those games are going to come or different things like that. So I think those types of players are definitely way better in a best ball structure.
Uncle Ted is one of our frequent listeners and commenters. He talks about red zone targets as maybe a good barometer when you're looking at maybe trying to build a foundation. Is that a metric there that you use maybe perhaps in managed leagues a little bit more, especially when you have to choose when you're starting a player?
Yeah, for sure. Those are one of the things that we're doing when we're going to go into the weekly is a little bit more of like a expected point total based projection system, and that really heavily kind of is based off of where you're getting your touches or where you're getting your targets, right? So like a 5 yard out is way more valuable in the red zone than it is from your own 20-yard line, right? From a fantasy point scoring standpoint. So that's definitely something that we're going to start. That's going to be incorporated in daily projections, but it's also really valuable for season long. If you know that they like to go to a particular player in the red zone, I think like Aaron Rodgers is a good example of this. He always had the like James Jones or other receiver that he loved to throw to in the red zone. And those guys were really good for fantasy because one, they were getting a bunch of targets there. And two, those are really stable. Those are like stable targets, right? When they get in the red zone, he's going to target him. And that's, those are 6 points if they catch that, right? So it goes a long way for your managed leagues to actually know that these guys have really good touchdown possibility. And I think that that's something that's definitely important to incorporate.
Indeed. We're going to talk a little bit about RotoWire's revamping of their projections and some of the players that Paul has maybe boosted or diminished a little bit doing the projections process. But first, you got to talk a little bit about Fantrax. Is there something that you wish your fantasy league had, or features that are missing from your current leagues? Bonus scoring, custom schedules or playoffs, deeper team settings? Well, look no further, because we have you covered with our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Fantrax even offers college fantasy football leagues. Create or join Fantasy Football Commissioner League. Invite your friends and dominate your draft this season. Fantrax is the top dynasty fantasy football platform in the industry. Fantrax is running a special promotion you don't want to miss. Sign up for free at fantrax.com/rotowire today to enter for your chance to win a signed Jamar Chase jersey. Simply create a new league or bring over your existing leagues for more chances to win. Go to fantrax.com/rotowire and sign up today. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. Might have to just do a couple of extra leagues just to try to get another bite of that Jamar Chase apple. I'm kind of showing my true colors here today on that here. I'm with RotoWire data scientist Paul Mammino. Paul has been in very huge role in upgrading our projections, especially for the football side. It's going to be on the baseball side in the spring as well. Very excited about this, Paul. Let's talk about in your course of doing the projections and doing some projection changes, you must have run into some players like, oh, I really like this guy a lot more than I thought I would.
Yeah, I think one of the guys we already touched on was Matthew Golden. I wasn't really that interested in him before I really was diving into creating the season-long projection. And then I kind of saw, at least from like a best ball standpoint, or a season-long standpoint, I saw just what I was talking about how players that go in that range, they typically do get these pretty high target shares just because the teams took them there and they kind of really want to force feed them the ball. So I think he was one that like really jumped out to me as someone that I was not expecting to be as high on. That's probably the first one that like really jumps out to mind. Another one was like a running back. And this is a little bit based on like what people have been saying, but I think like a Jordan Mason type, what Jordan Mason was doing last year was actually really, all the numbers under the hood were actually really good. And it kind of sounds like the Vikings are really pushing for him to get some more carries, especially in the red zone, because Jones historically hasn't been that great as a red zone runner. He's been a little bit, at least last year, he wasn't as great as a red zone runner. I think the stat is something along the lines of, I think they had 9 rushing touchdowns. And I think the other teams that were under 10 were all these pretty terrible offenses. So I think they're kind of really making a push to try to give Mason some more goal line carries. And he was actually really good at that last year. So I think that that's one from like a running back standpoint that jumped out to me. And it's somebody that as I'm kind of going through projections, I'm kind of trying to, because depending on where you're drafting, he's either, most projections are going to have him kind of behind ADP. So I think it's one that I'm kind of trying to push up a little bit more to try to get that a little closer to where you might have to take him.
I like that one a lot. And I know my colleague, Nick Whalen, is completely on board with you on that one there. By the way, in the NFFC right now, Jordan Mason, since July 1st, his ADP has been 98, Aaron Jones at 71. one of the closer gaps that you'll see between a running back combo. So even, I think everybody is kind of maybe honing in on that, but maybe not even enough. It's just, you look at some of the other running backs in that range. You're starting to look at, Jaylen Warren, someone else we talked about earlier there, he versus Caleb Johnson, the first of the Dallas running backs, Javonte Williams. I mean, it's very, very affordable still for Jordan Mason. I like that one a lot.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what
I know on Underdog where I draft a lot. On Underdog where I draft a lot, I know that cap's even tighter. I think Jones has fallen back more, and that is half PPR, which makes a lot more sense. So I think Mason's in that same spot, but Jones is a little further back.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you brought that up too, because your platform, know your league's scoring system, where players are going to be higher or lower on, and just you get in the same universe of players. Sometimes you start to get this cycle where everybody kind of builds off each other there too. Oh, he's rising at the NFFC, and so you kind of think, oh well, every platform we might be rising. That's not necessarily the case. So I think I'm glad you brought up Underdog, and make sure of course, tailor your draft strategy to the type of league that you're playing in.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's talk about what is new in the RotoWire projections, because I know you're doing a big part of revamping our projections. We kind of hinted at a little bit with ceiling and floor. What else can people know?
Yeah, I think the one thing that when I first started, I was kind of back testing a lot of what we were doing. And one of the things that I've kind of realized is, as a whole, our projections have actually been really good from the playing time standpoint, right? So, and as you know from baseball, and I don't know if you've done much of the football, but the content team, the writers, they're really going in there, and they're the ones that are making adjustments as they're kind of reading things of, who's getting the targets, who's getting the carries, and how is it kind of all going to play out. And that's one of the things we've actually been really good at. So that part's not changing, right? So they're going to continue to be, providing what they think the output is going to be, how many targets each individual player is going to get, and kind of reading the tea leaves in that sense. What we've done is we've changed the rest of the underlying numbers, right? So we've kind of created new formulas for yards per carry, for touchdown rate, for yards per target, and just all the efficiency metrics. So we've kind of revamped those efficiency metrics to try to make them a little bit more closer to what's actually happening, and using some more historic data and some more advanced analytic stuff, kind of like the broken tackles that we were talking about before, yards per route run, different things like that, to try to improve those underlying numbers from a season-long standpoint. And then, as I kind of alluded to, in season, we're going to do some other things where it's a little bit more of a usage-based, like, expected fantasy point underlying models, and take a little bit more into account the individual defense and team tendencies and spreads and things like that, to a little bit of a smarter and more intelligent way that will hopefully really improve our projections and kind of make them a lot stronger. And then on top of that, we're going to be incorporating ceiling and floor in a way that we weren't before. So every player, kind of as I was talking through, like the Jameson Williams example, every player, based on their historical numbers, they're going to have these different ranges of what can possibly happen, right? Players that have had these underlying metrics, what's kind of happened in the next year, right? So we can give a median, but we can also kind of say this particular player type, they have a way higher chance of of hitting that James Cook really high touchdown season, right? Or they have a really high floor because a Jacoby Myers type is going to get a bunch of targets, and we know he's going to get a bunch of targets, and that should be pretty stable. So we've kind of created different sliders around those that we're able to kind of work with and adjust the efficiency up, and then also take that same idea and turn them into ceiling projections, floor projections based on like games played and things like that. And then so like those will take into account, like a McCaffrey's a little more injury prone, right? So his floor will be lower than a similar running back who might have had the same median projection, and just kind of working through those. So those are the big things that are going in. Adding some more of that, trying to make it a little bit smarter under the hood while still keeping the thing we're really good at, which is adjusting playing time in a smart way.
I like that. And, football is so granular anyhow. I mean, it's, shorter, fewer samples, obviously. Maybe you have to dig in on find a way to do, to find a statistically reliable sample. Sometimes you have to go more on a per play basis as opposed to a per game basis, certainly over a per season basis. Whereas baseball, you have so many trials in a given season. It lends itself more to a longer form analysis.
Yeah, I think And with football, I think one of the other things that's really important is you need to be, as you're kind of saying, you need to be really quick with changes. Like as you know, from going through a baseball season, like there have been a million pitchers that have had a great 4-game stretch where nothing has changed, everything is clicking for them, and there's really no reason to change their projection. But in like football, as soon as those touches start going somewhere else, you need to adjust quickly, because if you don't, then you'll fall behind really, really fast. So you need to react really quickly to changes. And I think that's something, like, at least within the season, it's something that's really important to stay on top of, and something we do a pretty good job with. So it's really just like staying on top of that playing time, because for the most part, with some exceptions in football, the big breakouts, they really only come because the playing time changed, right?
Yeah.
The player themselves, they didn't really change that much on a skill basis. In baseball, skills cause a lot of changes and a lot of breakouts, right? A pitcher has a new cutter or something that they use. That's not really something that happens in football. It might be a scheme change from coaching, but it's really mostly just playing time.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's like a new frontier possibly at some point in time, like a new blocking technique is learned, or a new way to, I guess. And I'm sure that, and I'm understanding that it already happens. It probably already does, but it is different. You don't have the equivalent of, he went to drive line and added 2 miles an hour to his fastball. There are quarterback gurus though, that work on a player's throwing motion. I think of Josh Allen, for instance, who has improved markedly from season to season, but with some of the work he put in the offseason. It can happen, but it's measured differently.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's what makes football really tough. Because I guess what you were saying kind of with the new blocking scheme, it's not necessarily that, right? It's like Saquon went to the Eagles and he went from one of the worst O-lines to one of the best O-lines. And that caused an explosion. He himself probably didn't change all that much, but he was the same kind of player. He was just getting into space more. He was getting more carries where he was 5-6 yards down the field before someone touched him. And then when he made that one guy miss, that was a touchdown, as opposed to with the Giants, because I'm a Giants fan, making that first guy miss in the backfield, and then that turns into a 3-yard gain. So it's I think more that where there are inputs that can change efficiency, but for the most part, the player is the player. And in football, it's a little bit more of tuning in that how are they using them. And like when they are more efficient, their usage also changes, right? If like Marvin Mims was great last year on a per route basis, but if Sean Payton doesn't let him actually run routes, then it doesn't really matter for fantasy, because you can't predict when he's going to have 6 catches versus 2. It's more about once we start to see, if we see that he's going out there in week 1 and he's running 80% of routes, then his projection should change really fast. Right. Where that doesn't happen in baseball, right? If it doesn't happen in a lot of other sports. I think even basketball, to an extent, that doesn't really happen. I think it's really, baseball is the one where it's kind of or football is the one where it's the biggest factor, where playing time matters so much and we need to adjust really fast.
Exactly. The other thing too is like, how many times have we seen the backup be more efficient because they're in quote unquote hitters counts? They're in there after the defense is tired and he's fresh. Marvin Mims is more efficient because he runs 4 routes as opposed to the entire route tree. So what happens when they get that increasing playing time? Of course, it's not. They're not this. The efficiency doesn't carry over. The backup running backs is the greatest example of that, and that's a time honored thing. I mean, you remember like Amos Zaraway was a backup with the Steelers. He gets the starting job with the new team. Oh, really? He's not efficient as the starter. Who knew? That happens all the time.
Right. Like that happened with Tony Pollard behind Zeke. That happens with Jalen Warren and Najee Harris, I think, are other good examples. Like all of these things, and like even going to your Bengals, I think a lot of people really like Chase Brown as a breakout because he was so efficient in his couple of carries 2 years ago. I guess it was when I think it was his rookie year or his second year. And even him, once he got that role and they were giving him 90+% of the carries, he really wasn't that efficient with the touches. He was just getting 90+% of the carries because he was, he was the one getting every touch. So he does lose his efficiency and things like that. So it's really just, it shows how much football is really, playing time driven.
Yeah, it is opportunity driven. It's, situational driven. And I think that's the thing that's so beguiling, but so amazing at the same time. Like we try to estimate like, okay, which team really did improve their offensive line, which teams, I can't figure out what they're doing. Why did they do this? And having that all work in concert. Whereas like with baseball, it's in essence, it's batter versus pitcher. defense applies as the Milwaukee Brewers, but at the same time,
exactly.
It's really, at the end of the day, it's batter versus pitcher.
Yeah.
So, those are the main things I'm dealing with here. Before we get to a couple more of your guys, I want to just chime in real quick. We're going to have a note here from our folks at the Blue Wire Network. All right, Jeff Erickson here with Paul Mammino, RotoWire's data scientist. We've been talking about projections. We're going to finish up here, Paul. A couple more guys I want you to tell me about. I want to talk about a couple of we haven't talked too much on the quarterback side of things. How do you figure out how you want to project a guy like Caleb Williams, who could go a lot of different ways this year with a new head coach, an improved offensive line, some changes in the receiving core? The range of outcomes with him is pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I think for any kind of programmatic, he's a good example of where projections can fall from a programmatic standpoint, because all of his range of outcome is pretty heavily tied to a bunch of factors that we can't really put into a projection. We can't really quantify what Ben Johnson's going to do to an offense, right? So we can assume what we think it's going to do, and we can say the Lions were a little bit more run heavy, so maybe we kind of change the run pass split for a team. But also, and it's something that Johnson's talked about a ton, is that he really wants to get a high completion percentage for Williams. I think he kind of stated his goal is for Williams to complete 70% of his passes, which is not really something that Williams was really known for. He was kind of more the gunslingery type in college. He was kind of making these plays happen down the field. He wasn't necessarily taking those easy passes. So I think it's really hard to kind of dial in what does that do to a projection, and where should we actually put that in. So a lot of times we kind of have to go off of, and this is where using the content team to kind of understand what they're hearing, what they're reading is really useful, because it can kind of show, or they can make some adjustments and say, I think that his yards per target or his yards per attempt is going to go down a ton because Johnson's going to try to get a bunch of easy button passes for him and things like that. And then we can kind of have all of those funnel down into a projection. And you can kind of see that with some of the moves that they made, right? Going after a Luther Burden, who has some really interesting yards after the catch stuff. So there might be some kind of short, quick passes to him, drafting a tight end in Colson Loveland really high. So it's going to kind of adjust the overall function of the offense. And they might be a little bit more, bring the yards per target down or yards per attempt down, but kind of improve on some of the efficiency metrics. And I think that that's where you kind of build out that projection. But he's someone that it's so hard to even dial in a really accurate ceiling and floor, because as you said, so many different things can kind of go into that.
Another such quarterback, another second-year quarterback, Drake May. We had our Patriots preview on Sirius XM today talking about them, and I'm intrigued. I think there's reasons to really believe in his abilities, but the environment around him, has it improved enough that he can become fantasy viable?
I think it can. I think he's someone that I'm really taking a big chance on in a lot of my drafts, mostly because of the rushing floor and the rushing ceiling that he has. I don't know. They really improved the receiving core. They tried to improve the receiving core. I don't know if you can necessarily say it's much, much better. It all depends on kind of what you think of Kyle Williams and Stephon Diggs. But I think in the games that he played last year and he was healthy, the rushing numbers were such a big buoy to his production that really all he needs to do is kind of maintain those really good rushing numbers and just be a little bit better as a passer, and maybe they actually as a whole offense improve a little more. And kind of in the same boat as Johnson, maybe Josh Daniels in there, they kind of more kind of complete some more shorter pass types a little more and kind of go from there. So hopefully I am really buying into him as a upside play for this year.
All right, very good. Paul, it's fun talking projections with you. Thanks for coming on board today, folks. Check it out at RotoWire. Use promo code YouTube15. Go check out our RotoWire projections. Get 15% off any RotoWire product. Again, promo code YouTube15. Please hit that like button there. Please subscribe so you can get notices whenever we do a new podcast here on the RotoWire YouTube page. And for those of you who want to catch us streaming, thanks everyone for listening in. Have a great day.